Most photographers misunderstand ISO as just a brightness setting. And while there's an entire physics-based conversation on exactly how ISO works, we're not going to go that far down the rabbit hole. But we are covering where it came from, what the numbers actually mean, and the effect it has on your images. So by the end of this video, you'll have a better handle on what to set your ISO to get the best usable results. ISO didn't entirely start out as an in-camera setting. Before the digital photography days, it was literally just the type of film that you would load into your camera, and you'd set the ISO dial to match the film you loaded into it so the camera knew what it was working with. Your film was chosen by its ISO number: ISO 100 for bright sunny conditions, ISO 400 for overcast or shade, and ISO 800 or 1600 for indoors or low light. And once the film was in your camera, you were committed to all 24 or 36 exposures on that roll of film with the same ISO, which meant if you miscalculated the lighting situation you were shooting in, you either pushed through it or changed film rolls and wasted whatever was left. But when digital photography replaced film with a sensor, that's when ISO as an entirely in-camera setting was born. If you ever thought ISO was an acronym, don't be embarrassed. I did too. But actually it's not. The organization behind it is called the International Organization for Standardization, which in English would make an acronym of IOS, not ISO. And in French, it would be OIN, which stands for Organisation Internationale de Normalisation. So instead of having a different acronym in every language, they chose the word ISO from the Greek word isos, meaning equal, as in this standard is the same no matter where you live in the world and what language you speak. And some people call it ISO while others just call it ISO. So now that you know where ISO came from and why it's called that, let's look at the numbers, specifically what those numbers actually mean, how high they go, and what happens when you push them too far. ISO numbers double or half with each step. It's the same logic as shutter speed and aperture, where each step equals one stop of light. The standard ISO range goes from 100 to 200 to 400 to 800 and so on, all the way up to 25,600. Not all cameras have a native base ISO of 100. Some go lower and some start higher, and the lowest native ISO is where that camera gets its best dynamic range. And most cameras have a native ceiling as well. My Canon 5D4 goes up to 32,000 natively, and newer cameras push that even further, some hitting expandable ranges of 51,200, 102,400, and 204,800? I mean, what? Which raises the obvious question, who actually uses an ISO of over 200,000? That seems insane. But the answer is very few people, mainly those in situations where any image beats no image and low quality isn't an issue. People like nocturnal wildlife photographers or photojournalists in rooms that they can't light. Situations where getting the shot matters more than what the shot actually looks like. Also worth knowing, AI noise reduction in editing software has gotten really good in recent years. Images shot at ISO 25,600 or higher that would have been completely unusable even 5 years ago can now be cleaned up to something you'd actually want to print. So the software is finally catching up to what the hardware can do. That raises the question, if we have software that can make high ISO usable, why not just crank it up every time? And the answer here is that there's a trade-off. The common misconception is that high ISO creates noise in your image, but in reality, ISO is just amplifying the signal from the camera's sensor. So really, it's just amplifying the noise that's already there from the dark underexposed image. Two things actually happen with the noise situation. First, you get what's called chroma noise, those green and red splotchy patches that you see in the dark areas of an image. That's not green exactly. Those color splotches are caused by the red, green, and blue channels on the sensor that are being amplified unevenly. The second thing that happens is that the edges of your image get softer. Part of that is the noise itself burying the fine details, and part of it is the camera's noise reduction as it smooths over the problem. And this usually kicks in harder at higher ISOs, but in doing so, it also smooths over the original texture in an image. So in hair, eyes, or fabric detail, you'll usually see it there first. Modern cameras handle noise reduction better than cameras from 10 years ago, but they're not immune to this problem entirely. If ISO finally makes sense as more than just a brightness slider, do me a favor and hit like. It tells YouTube to show this to more photographers who are still trying to make sense of it. So now you know what ISO is and where it came from and what it costs you at higher numbers. The last piece is understanding exactly where it fits alongside aperture and shutter speed and how to actually use it when you're setting up a shot. shot. Here's what makes ISO different from the other two settings. Aperture is the creative setting that controls depth of field, or how much of your image is in focus from front to back, and how blurry of a background you want. Shutter speed is also a creative setting that controls motion to freeze it or to blur it. ISO merely amplifies the sensor signal from the aperture and shutter speed settings that are chosen. So since there's no creativity with this setting, this makes it the easiest of the three settings to understand and use. But just because it's easy to use doesn't tell us how it fits into practice when shooting in manual. The common misconception is to just start adjusting your settings right away. But best practice is to add enough extra light outside your camera settings first to help expose your image, if at all possible. Then, assuming ISO is already set to its native base of, say, 100, you set your aperture for the depth of field you want. Then you set your shutter speed for how you want motion to look. Do you want to freeze it or blur it creatively? Take a test shot and then check your exposure with the values that you've chosen. At that point, if you still want to increase your exposure, that's when ISO comes in. But if aperture and shutter speed are already getting you the exposure that you want, leave ISO at base. And it's worth saying out loud that the goal with ISO is usually to use as low of a setting as you can while still getting the shot. Now let's talk about practical starting points, what numbers to use and when. If you're shooting outdoors in good light, start at ISO 100 or whatever your native base is. If you're shooting outdoors in shade or overcast or later in the day and you're not able to add light to your scene any other way, start at ISO 400. And if you're shooting at nighttime or indoors without any supplemental lighting like flash or constant lighting, expect to push your ISO from 800 or 1600 or even higher, depending on how dark the space is. But watch your images for visible noise as you increase your ISO. Now, what about auto ISO? Should you use it? When you're shooting outdoors in natural light with your aperture and shutter speed set manually, auto ISO works well and helps to navigate the changing light conditions as you're moving around. In daylight conditions like that, the camera tends to stay in a sensible range, usually between 100 and 400, and it adjusts as the light changes. But shooting indoors without flash or extra lighting is a whole different story. The camera sees darkness and it pushes that ISO as high as it needs to get what it thinks is a proper exposure. If you use auto ISO, set a maximum cap in your camera settings. Most cameras will let you do this. That way it doesn't go to some crazy high number you didn't ask for and give you a bunch of pixelated Minecraft characters. If you want help with starting points for all three settings in manual mode in the situations you shoot in most, grab my free guide, Shoot Like a Pro. The link is in the description. Even though ISO is the easiest of the three elements in the exposure triangle, it's still only one part of it. Shutter speed tends to be the next easiest to understand as it literally just controls motion. But aperture is perhaps the most complicated and misunderstood element of all three. To dive deeper into aperture and learn a super easy way to use it, watch this next.